Let's get started. Like I said, I have a mostly foreseen to do demos and show what things do, but I wanted to add a few slides to just position things. First of all, this is me. I haven't looked at all the people on the attendee list, but I think most of you will know me. For those of you who don't, I'm the CTO at Four Pees, which means I stick my nose into everything that has to do with technical stuff, and by extension, other things as well, essentially. In terms of background, maybe relevant for this session, I started out at Enfocus, but I also co-founded a company called Gradual Software, which happened to have invented Switch. And so I do know a few things about Switch from that time. That was Gradual Software. Gradual Software was acquired by ESCO, and as such, Switch became an Enfocus product. As you probably know, Enfocus is a business unit inside of ESCO. So that for some positioning. Let's get going with apps. Apps. I'm assuming that most of you know Switch. If not, then this is going to be very complicated Four Pees Café. In Switch, there are two concepts that are very similar indeed. Actually, three concepts if you want to look at it that way, but let's focus on these two here. We have something that is called configurators, and there is something that is called apps. A configurator is something that ships with the product. In both cases, you can think of this as a small plugin for Enfocus Switch that adds some functionality, but the configurator ships with the product. An app comes from the Enfocus Appstore, and you have to go there and download it and install it on the Switch instance that you're running. The configurator was invented originally to integrate with other software, and that is still what happens today. So if you are running, or if you want to run Calas PDF Toolbox in Switch, then you would use the PDF Toolbox configurator. There are actually, I always forget because I tend to ignore one, but there are 4 or 5 configurators to drive different parts of PDF Toolbox functionality inside of Switch. So that ships with the product. It's always available. You can upgrade it through Switch, and it drives PDF Toolbox. An app, like I said, you have to go hunt for those, and you can find them on the Enfocus Appstore. And it can be used for just about anything. So some of these apps also integrate other software. In other cases, the app implements a little tool if you want. And there is lots of built-in tools to Switch. Some of them might do what you want in a particular workflow, but sometimes there is functionality that is missing. And then apps can help you to accomplish your task in a workflow without you having to write a script for that. The difference between the configurators and the apps as well, and that is maybe also interesting to know, is that apps don't need the configurator module from Switch. On the other hand, as you can see here, an app can be free or payable. And that means that for some apps, you will have to pay once, a one-time purchase price. For other apps, you have to have a subscription. Okay. What is also important for apps, and to some extent that's also true for configurators, but for configurators, I don't think that there is that much of an issue usually. What is also important is that certain apps are only compatible with certain Switch versions. And specifically, there might be a minimum version of Switch that you need. Enfocus has gone through 2 environments, development environments that someone can use to write scripts and apps and configurators, a classic or legacy, I think they call it. And then something that is newer and is based on Node.js. apps that are using that Node.js environment, the modern environment, will only work from the version of Switch that also supports that environment. So that is something to keep in mind, but that is mentioned on the App Store and so on, and Switch will not let you install a version of an app or an app that is not compatible with your version of Switch. So normally that should not be a big issue. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? Well, I don't want to talk about Switch apps in general. What I want to talk about is the apps that we have written for the Switch App Store. And specifically, I want to talk about 3 of them. So if you search the App Store, you'll find 4 apps created by 4 Pees at the moment. And 3 of those are real project apps, if you want. The 3rd one, Stock, that is in this list, is a lot of fun. There is another Four Pees Café that you can watch to see what it does and how it should be used, but I will not talk about it here. And the main reason I wanted to do this overview is because we do get a reasonable amount of questions about the functionality in these apps and how to use them. So I wanted to show some of the use cases to complement what you can read in the documentation for these apps. So I'm going to start talking about create text file, then we'll look at creating a file using a template, which is the much more advanced version of the first one if you want. And then we're also going to talk about Monday.com integration. And I think that is it as far as my presentation goes. So I'm going to switch to, well, I'm going to switch to Switch, which is a very complicated sentence. Make this a little bit bigger here to begin with. So the first app in here, and you can see that I've prepared some sample flows or example flows for you, and I will go over them and explain what this app was conceived to do and how you can use it in a workflow. And I'm starting with the simplest app. This is also the first one that we created. The name is create text file, and the purpose was very simple. Sometimes in a workflow, you need to write some stuff to a text file. And with a text file, what we mean is a file that is not binary. Yeah, it doesn't mean it has to be a file that has a .text extension. It could just as well be a JSON file or an XML or a JDF or anything that uses text encoding as opposed to an image or a PDF or something like that. And create text file, if I select it here, you can also see the properties. It has a number of properties, and the way I am using it here already illustrates the trigger property. We gave it 2 different ways to launch the app. And the first one is with a timer. The second one is on a new job. A new job we'll see in a second. This flow uses timer triggering. And what that means is there is no input connection to this app. So essentially, nothing comes into this app to say, now you have to do something. It is purely a timer based on a certain frequency in seconds. So it's set to 2 here, which means that the app will be executed every 2 seconds, roughly. Switch documentation will tell you that if you use timers and so on, that it is roughly the time period that you provide there, depending on what other things Switch is doing at that time. Why would you use this? Well, one of the possible uses could be I need to write out a small JSON file or a small text file once every day, for example. And that is going to trigger a workflow that is then going to do something for me. Yeah. What you can also choose as a property is the name of the output file and then also the content of the file. And I'm just going to launch this workflow for a start. And let's let it create some output there, and then I'm going to stop it again. At least that shows us what the output is that is being generated here. So you can see that there is a little trigger.txt file. The reason that I get this 234 is because that output folder has been set to strip the unique name in Switch, but add a version number at the end. So this is what I get. And if I would open this in my Visual Studio Code, oh, come on, there. Then there is some text in there, and you can see there is also a variable part in that text file as well. So it's a very simple content in there. And the way to do that is also very simple. The whole content of the file is actually a property, and I can set that property from just text, or just one line of text that uses variables, or multi-line text with variables, or I could use a JavaScript expression that determines what the file content is. Here it is multi-line text with variables. Some of the text is fixed, and then some of it is a switch variable. In this case, the date and time, system date and time. Okay. So every 2 seconds, the app is triggered and it writes out the text file, and it sends that text file through the outgoing connection. What you do with that text file afterwards is none of our concern, essentially. Yeah. So you just send it to the next folder in the workflow, and this workflow can do whatever it wants to do with it. The other way you can use this is by building it into a workflow. So here I have an input folder, I have the same create text file app and an output folder, and you can more or less ignore this one here. This is an internal app that we use for testing, and that will just send some test file into this workflow. And you can see that this is different. Now my app does have an incoming connection. Yeah. And the trigger property reflects that. So now it says, what is the trigger for create text file to write something out? Well, the trigger in this case is a new job. So it is only going to write out a file that goes to the output folder if there is an input job here. The input job that comes in itself is actually going to be deleted. It is only the file created by create text file that is going to go to the output here. And I have the same, I actually am not sure what is in here. So there is a JSON file. The JSON file is written as text essentially, and you can see that there is a variable here and then some other variables. So basically we're picking up private data from the job. We're also picking up the email from the job, and we're again picking up the date, all of that with switch variables, but that is going to be written out as a JSON file. And so if I launch this, my test app is automatically going to generate a test job for me, and that goes to create text file, and it's written to the output. And if I now put that into Visual Studio Code, then you see what the result is. So the variables that I had from Switch have been replaced by the actual values of the job that came in. You can see that I generate a number here. The rest is text. I have the date and time again, and I have the email address that was connected to that particular incoming job as well. And remark that what I said in the beginning, this is not a text file. The extension of this one is input.json. So it's a JSON file that has been written out. It's a type of file that uses text encoding, and that works just fine. So not very complicated as an app. A file comes in or no file comes in if we use the timer version. And then what it writes out, what it generates is the text file or JSON file or XML or JDF, whatever you need it to be, that is that this app generates, and that goes to the output folder. The input file, like I said, disappeared. We haven't seen it in the output. It is just disappears. Of course, if you still need the input folder, that's all the input file, sorry, that's also very simple to do in Switch. You just make a copy of a file that runs through a flow. You send that copy to create text file, and then it generates output for you, and you still have the original version somewhere else. So this is not really a limitation. It just makes create text file easier to deal with. So that's the first app. Like I said, it's also the first app that we created. It's very simple. And of course, what is easy to realize is that for simple text files and a simple JSON like I just did, this is quite easy to use, but there are obvious limitations. If I start thinking about, oh, but I want to generate some kind of more complex file, it is quickly going to become much more difficult to do that. And because of that, we invented another app, a second app that does something with text files, and that is create file from template. Create file from templates that will essentially do the same thing. It still generates an output file. Yeah. So I can build it into a workflow again, and it will generate an output file, and it still has to be a file that uses a text encoding. So we're still talking about a .text or .json or XML or JDF. However, you don't have to specify the content of the file by just typing it into Switch. You can specify the content by making a template, and the templating engine that is used is called AJS. That's why this thing here is called AJS. But I can just as well put AJS in an HTML file or in something else. So my template, it doesn't really matter what the extension of that is. But the essence is I can make a template, and the app is going to take certain pieces of information and allow you to put them in that template. That sounds very abstract, but I will give you two examples of how to use that. And the first one is, well, my challenge is to create a simple HTML file. It could actually be a much more complex HTML file as well. AJS, this templating engine that we're using, normally gets used in website development. And so it is used to generate complete website pages with data in them. And so there isn't really a limitation to how complex that can become. So what do I have here? Well, I have something here in the HTML. So let's see what this looks like when we open it in an editor. And then you see this. Still pretty simple HTML. I have something that looks like standard HTML. There is some style information, so CSS information in here. We even import a font definition. And then in the body of the HTML, we have one line that is fixed, a header line. And then the other line is using this strange construct in the middle here, this thing that starts with a smaller than sign and ends with a bigger than sign. And that is exactly what AJS allows you to do. It allows you to put placeholders in a text file, and those placeholders will be replaced by some data coming in. And that is what the app does. So the app allows you to specify what the template file is, And it also allows you to specify what the input source for that template is. And in the apps case, the input source is always a JSON. JSON with any type of information. We don't really put limits to that again. It is any type of information. So let's have a look at Switch and how this is configured. But I will start by showing you what I have done in this workflow. I've used create text file app to trigger this workflow every 5 seconds, as you can see. So that generates a small text file. That text file triggers an HTTP request, which is a built-in tool inside of Switch. And that HTTP request uses or calls a hopefully funny API, REST API that will return a geeky joke to us. That's the description of the API, at least. Yeah. And what it generates, the HTTP requests just returns what this URL gives us. What it will generate is a JSON file. Yeah. So the output of HTTP requests is a small JSON. And I make a copy here to just see what that is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold this connection. And then let's just start the workflow. That should put a JSON file in there. And then we're going to stop it again. And let's see what we have in this JSON file. So it's a very simple JSON. It has only one element called joke, and then that has a value. Back to the template. The one element that we had in this JSON file was called joke. That is exactly what you see here. Yeah? So the idea is that whatever you have in this JSON file that comes in, you can use the elements in there, the properties in there, and so on, to then display them in this template. And this is, of course, a very simple example. There is only one piece of information, and it uses that in this template. And what does that give us? Well, then we have to release this. I will let it run through, and then that gives us a JSON file in the output. No, so sorry, that's the JSON file here that we just saw, and that gives me an HTML file in the output. That makes more sense. And then that HTML file we can now look at in Visual Studio Code. And you can see where in the templates I had this reference to the element that was in the JSON. Now I have the actual value in there. So this template engine replaces any placeholder that we have in the template by the actual value that it reads from that incoming JSON file. And so what I end up with is something that replaces that. And so now I have valid HTML. Yeah. Of course, this is a bit of a demo example. What would make more sense, for example, is if you use the send email mail send tool here in Switch, you can specify an HTML mail and well, you could build that HTML with all the values inside by using the templating engine and a proper template that you specify here. The properties of this app are more complex than the properties of the previous one because you can do more with it as well. There is actually good documentation for this. On the App Store, you can download the documentation file as well, and that gives you multiple ways of how this app can be used and an explanation of all of the properties. Let's look at them briefly here, though. The first thing is I need to specify where the template is. And the easiest way to do that is by just saying, oh, the template is a file on my file system. And then I select what file it is. And in this workflow, I actually point to this joke.html template that lives in one of my professional services folders. Yeah, I have other options as well. I could say, oh, the template is the file that comes in. If I already have some kind of template that goes through this workflow, I could use that as the template file. That is not the most common thing. The template could also be a dataset file. If I know that I generate files in this workflow and they have a dataset attached that is the actual template that I want to use, and this could make sense because it allows you to build some variability in there, and depending on the item that goes through the workflow, perhaps use a different template. Well, then I can set that up as well. But by far the most common thing that you can do here is say, my template, I've created that using Visual Studio Code or whatever, and it is it's in a particular folder. It doesn't have to be Visual Studio Code, just to make that clear. Any text editor that can generate a text file will do. These AJS templates are simply text files, so nothing special required there. The second piece of information that you need to specify is, where do the variables come from? If I have a template and I know my template contains placeholders, and one of the elements here that I add is joke, where does that come from? Well, what my workflow or what my app here says in this workflow is that that comes from the incoming job. Yeah. So basically, I'm telling the app the job that will come in. So the job that comes from here, from this part and goes into the app, is going to be a JSON file, and that is going to contain all the variable data that I want to merge with my template. Again, I have other options. The data could be in a particular file. Maybe you want to specify the path to a file based on the file that is going through the workflow. The data could be attached to the job again as a data set. Maybe the data is just text. Yeah? And if I choose that option, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that I am going to type the variables in here, and that allows me to use the switch variables again in this thing, and I can add as much or as little variables here as I want. I actually don't need to have quotes here. Yeah, so in this case, anything that comes before the equal sign is the name of a variable, and what comes after it is the actual value. So if I wanted to use this system in the workflow that I just created and that I just showed you, then I need to have a variable called joke, because that's what we use in our template, and I need to give it a value, which can be just text, or it can use the defined variables from switch to pick up any value from the job that came in. So this is also a possibility. And then the last possibility is that I can have a JSON as text, which allows me to type an actual JSON file here, which is probably not very common, but well, we made it possible anyway. So in this workflow, we do what is probably the most common. The template comes from a file, and the variables come from a JSON file that is traveling through the workflow. And then the last decision is, what do I want to do with the output? And send to outgoing connection is what you would normally, well, probably intuitively would think would happen. This is going to fill in any variables or any placeholders in the template, and it is going to send it to the outgoing connection. That is what we just saw happen in my output. I end up with the filled in HTML files. But I can also do something else. I can attach that as a data set again, and then use it further down the workflow. If you're going to use send email or mail send, one of the options of mail send is to use the template or to use the HTML, the body of the email that is attached as a data set. And this would allow me to do that. Or I can write to file. Now, that suspiciously sounds like the first option, because we do write to a file and that file is sent to the output folder. The difference is that when I select write to file, I have to specify which file. And this gives me another very interesting possibility. And that is what I explore in the next demo flow. Yeah. So what if I always want to add information to the same file? And a prime example, and also the simplest example, is somewhere I have a CSV file, and every time a job goes through the workflow, I want to add information about that job to that CSV file. Yeah. This could be for logging. It could be that these are orders going through a workflow, and for each order, you want to write delivery information or and so on information to a CSV file, and then once a day you want to look at that and do and prepare shipments. So even though I have multiple items going through a workflow, I want to have all the information in one file. How can I do that? Well, the beginning of the workflow is exactly the same. I have the same trigger element. I have the same HTTP request. Actually, this whole thing is a copy of the previous workflow. Yeah? It looks exactly the same. The only difference is here I say write to file, and that means I have to specify which file I am going to write to, and it points to somewhere, and what it points to is here. Yeah, so I have a folder called test outputs and then jokes.csv. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove that from there so that this folder is empty. I still point to that file, and that's not a problem. It doesn't have to exist. And then I am going to say that the information, the variables are coming from the incoming job, just as in the previous workflow. But I want to write to that file, and I want to use the file name jokes.csv, and I want to append to it. And this I can change. So I can choose overwrite or append. I'm going to choose append because for each job that passes through, I want to write to that same file. Why would I ever need overwrite? Well, I could use overwrite, and then the file name is perhaps every time different. So for each job that passes through the system, I write job information to a separate log file. That's not what I want in here. I want to really only write to that CSV file. So let's have this run. What you can see is that that file already appeared. And it is called jokes.csv because that's what I had specified in my property there. And it has a certain size, 284 bytes. If I start the workflow again, then you will see that the file will just grow bigger. So what happens is that each job that passes through, the system is indeed writing to the same CSV file. And if I look at the CSV file, it gives me, and I made an example that is very simple. It writes out the unique ID of the job that came in. It writes out the date and time of when this happened, and it has been configured to run every, I don't know, 2 seconds or something. So you can see that it follows roughly 2-second intervals. And then this joke that we have there, and that we already saw in the previous flow, those are just written there. And every time you now write to or you run this flow, it will add information to the CSV. Now, there is one thing that is very strange, and that is that if I look at the CSV again, it has a header, and that header appears only once. That's a very neat trick because I'm appending information to this all the time. And apparently some of the information was only written the first time that it ran and not the subsequent times. And for CSV, you very often want that because if you don't have a header, it's hard to understand what's going on. So you you would prefer to do that. And there are definitely other scenarios where that is useful as well. How does that work? Well, there is no real magic going on here other than a nice app that gives you some ways to work with these templates. So let's look at the template for the CSV file. So this template now looks a little bit more complex. And like I said, if you read the documentation for this app, it will give you all kinds of useful ways of knowing or of using these placeholders that you can have in the templates. And I use a few different ones here. You can see that I can actually write JavaScript in these placeholders. Placeholder starts here, it ends at the end of the line, and I can use JavaScript. And this templating engine that we're using will calculate the JavaScript and will give you a nice final result. What it's going to write out is this, and this is, of course, the header of that CSV file. If I go back here and we look at the CSV, it says unique ID, date, and joke, and that is exactly what I write out here with commas in between because it's a comma-separated file. Why is it written only once? Well, if you're using this, what I said is the data, the variables come from the incoming file. That's what we say here. The variables come from the incoming job. That is true and it is not true. It is true because we pick up this joke variable. It is also not true because we always inject additional variables that you can use. So even though the JSON file here is very simple and only contains one thing, you can still use fourpees.info.id. That is something that we inject in that JSON file for you to use. And what it does is it gives you the unique ID of the job that triggered the app. You can also use fourpees.privatedata.date. Why? Well, if I look here, switch defines some private data for me here. And the private data name is date, and it is set to the system time and date. Yeah. And our app always takes all the private data attached to the job and it adds that to that JSON file. So not only can you use the information that comes from that JSON that travels through the workflow, but you can also use all of this other information. Now, how do you know what information you can use? I've said it 3 times now, I think, and now I will open the documentation just to make sure that you get the point. If I look here at the part where we talk about variable replacement, yeah, you will see all the things you can do with this templating engine. And you also will find a chapter about injected variables. And injected variables are the ones that the app creates for you and that you can use even though they are not in the incoming JSON file. And there you will see things like info.id, and you will see things like where was the private data, and so on, and some examples. So fourpees.info.name will be replaced by the name, including extension, of the incoming job. Fourpees.privatedata.anything will be replaced by the private data field with that particular name. Yeah, that's the trick. Now, the trick for the header is also in here. And that is that there will always be a variable that is called fourpees.app.appending to existing file. And the app is smart enough to not only always insert that, but to also give it a value. Yeah? That value will be false if the file didn't exist. So it's the first time that we're writing to that file. That value is true if I have to, it's complicated. It's true if we are appending to a file, and that means that the file already exists. And that is exactly what we use here. So what we're saying is, if we're writing to a new file, if the file doesn't exist yet, then write out this header information. If the file does exist, this whole first line is not executed. It is simply skipped. And that means that only the second line is written out, and you add information to the existing CSV. So in any scenario where you want to keep writing to the same file, you can use this trick to make sure that if there is any type of header, you only write out the header the first time and not for any subsequent writes to the document. Yeah. The only other trick I use here, and that's because I ran into it with this API, if you write out a CSV, for example, but this is not really app specific, but if you write out a CSV, for example, the values that you write to the columns shouldn't contain commas. That's a problem, because then Excel, or I used numbers here, is going to think that that is also a column separation. Yeah, so that's a problem. You can overcome that by writing these quotes around each of the values. And then, even though my jokes may contain commas, there is one already there, even though the text may contain commas, you can see that they are still nicely kept together as one value, and I only have 3 columns. If I wouldn't do that, if I would take away the quotes here, then I would end up with a variable amount of columns depending on what I get back from this API, essentially. So that is some trick. The other thing that can be really difficult, you can see that I don't have a line break here. If I do this, so if I have a line break at the end of my file, I'm going to end up with blank lines in between what I write. So what is written out here has to be controlled quite well as well. AGS can help with that. Some of the AGS tags, it makes a difference whether you have an equal sign, for example, or a hyphen, or they have all kinds of different tag beginnings and endings. And those do things, and they might, for example, eat up any white space that lives in front or behind the tag, and you can use that to determine exactly what is going to be written out by that template. Okay, so a little bit more complex. If you want to use this, I would advise you very highly. I think that's number 5 time that I say this now. I would advise you very highly to read the documentation. The documentation will point you to the documentation for AGS online, and I would advise you to read that as well. It's written very correctly. It's a little bit dense in terms of the website for AGS. You'll see that. Which is why I try to at least give some examples in the documentation as well, and makes it a little bit easier to understand. Okay, so that's the second app, and then we have one app left, and I'm going to have to zoom out a little bit for this one because the workflow is a little bit more complex. I am going to just run this first so that you can see what happens. And then I will explain what it is that happens here. Now, while this workflow is starting, these are, if you would go to the Enfocus Appstore, you would see an app for Monday.com. If you then look in Switch, what lives in Switch, you will see that there is add to Monday.com, there is get from Monday.com, updates, and upload. So you download and install one app, but in fact, you get 4 smaller apps that each do a particular task. And this is something that Enfocus calls app bundles. It makes it easier to download that from the App Store, and it makes it easier in Switch because each of these smaller apps is now simpler and can focus on one particular task. So I've done that. I've put some of this stuff in the workflow. I think, yeah, you can also see that there is a PDF toolbox item in here, and actually a second one. This is a demo workflow, which is why there are also some holds in here, so that not everything happens at the same time. Sometimes Switch is too quick when it does things, and in the demo that makes it hard because you can't see what is happening. And we want to see what is happening. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drop a file in this input folder, and I'm going to drop a file in the other input folder, and then we're going to go to Safari. And in Safari, you see Monday.com. Now you can look at the nice colors changing and the things getting added while I explain the rest of this. What is Monday.com? It is a I don't know if you want to call this a dashboard, but it's not a bad name for it. It allows you to give you a view on structured information. Monday.com by itself doesn't define what the information is that you're following and what happens with it. It just gives you a way to build dashboards to keep an overview of things. And what I've done here is I built something that could be a production dashboard for a printer. You can see two locations where we print. One is in Belgium, one is in the United Kingdom. Of course, I faked that a little bit in the switch flow. You have an input for Belgium, an input for the United Kingdom. Probably these would be two switch installations, or they could be one switch installation where we look at metadata for the job and decide what type of job it is. And then what Monday.com allows you to do is create columns. And so I have a job ID column, a preview column. So if I hover over this, you can see the previews that were generated. An arrival date column when it was last modified, and a status column. And in the status column, I have, how can I do this here? In the status column, I have defined all the different statuses for my files in my workflow, ranging from this job just arrived to this job errored out because of a pre-flight problem to it was pre-flighted, printed, and delivered. And the idea is, of course, that files flow through the dashboard, and when they get to a certain point, flow through the workflow rather. And if they get to a certain point, they update Monday.com so that you have a nice overview of what is going on with your jobs. That's the concept. Yeah. And the way we implemented the concept is, first of all, by implementing this dashboard on Monday.com. And that means that you set up a board, you set up these groups, you set up all the columns, you define which values are allowed in those columns and so on. But all of that is flexible. I set it up this way because I like it. I like these colors and so on. If you need more information that could be added to it, it could be structured differently and so on and so on. Yeah. And then if I've set up the dashboard here, I can basically set up a switch workflow that will work with the dashboard. And so when the file hits add to Monday.com, it will be added to one of these groups. If it reaches the next point, which is it has been pre-flighted, the status is updated to pre-flighted, the green one. When it gets to being produced, it's changed to printed. And when it was printed and it is now ready for delivery, it gets changed to delivery. Like I said, this is a demo workflow. The only status changes that you see here is because there is a little timer in between so that not everything happens at the same time, but that you could use this exactly like this in a production workflow that you are running. How does this work? Well, the link between Switch and Monday.com is created by this Monday.com Switch app. And like I said, it exists out of, can I zoom in one more? Is it still doable? No. There. It exists out of 4 small little apps. that are not that small if you start looking at properties, because you still have to configure things a little bit. But these apps communicate to Monday.com. The demo flow here only uses 3 of them. Why 3? Well, we want to create a new job on the Monday.com dashboard. That is this add to Monday.com. Then we want to update information for it. And there is an app for that, obviously, called Update on Monday.com. And then there is one more, slightly more advanced thing that we do, and that is this upload. An upload in Monday.com is used to change an existing item, but specifically to associate a file with that item. Yeah. So if you want to create a preview and have a preview in Monday.com, you have to send a file to it, and that means that you have to use this upload little app. So update is just updating all the other values, like the status or the name or the job ID or whatever. Upload is associating a file with that item. That's just the way Monday.com works, and we have implemented the apps around that. How they work are very similar. Each of these apps uses a token. The token is to authenticate with Monday.com. Once you have an account, you also have a way to get that token from your account, and then you put that here, and then I can use select from library that does communication with Monday.com, and it shows me all of the different dashboards that I have created. And if I choose a dashboard, I can then add the other things. So here I define a group, and the group is taken from private data in this case. Yeah. I can also define the name of the row, and the name of the row is the job in this example. And then I have any other columns that I want to set. And in my case, that is the title column, which I don't know which one it is actually. Probably the first one. I have a status column, which is arrived, and I have an arrived column, which is the system date and time, basically, that I sent to Monday.com. There is no modified column because this is something that was available in Monday.com itself. It automatically will keep track of when this record was modified the last time. Yeah, and then once I add something here, Monday.com will return to me an ID. And that ID is what I need to then further update that, that item if I have any updates. So I have to store that somewhere, and I store it in private data. This is exactly how you would normally work with a database as well in Switch. If you create something, a row in a database, then the database would typically return an ID for that row that you can later use to update or ask for new information from the database, and you have to keep track of that somehow. And the keeping track part we do in private data, and so this is this FP Monday row ID is the name of the private data field that I have selected to do that. And then the rest is very, very quickly explainable. We have a Preflight profile that will either lead to a good production file or a bad production file. And in both cases, we do an update. And if we look at, so this is very similar to what we did before. And if I look at what gets updated, well, in this case, I set the status to pre-flighted, and that's when that field turns green. And then I set the date field again to a value I want. But in essence, I can update any of the columns for that particular item. If you would look at the other one, then you would see that for columns to set, it would say status error. Yeah. So essentially, whatever you need in the workflow, you can shoot to Monday.com, who will then simply display it. After that, what we also do is we create an image. So I have a save as image action here. This is using PDF Toolbox. That's going to create a preview for me. And then that preview is uploaded to Monday.com to a column called preview. And if I again do select from library, you'll see that I can also get all the different columns that live in my Monday.com board. So the name, the job ID, the preview, the arrived fields. This was the original date that it arrived, and then the modified date, and then the status here as well. So I can write to any of those fields. And then the last one is again the same thing. Here we fake that the job was now printed and then gets delivered. And then we have a small update again, and this one just sets the status to delivered, and then it turns purple here. So very brief recap of what happened here. A job comes in. Based on information of the job, it gets added to my Monday.com board. And that gives me an initial range of columns and values in here. I remember what the ID of the item is in private data and switch, and then I update the item as it travels through the workflow. And this does not have to be a production dashboard. It could just as well focus on delivery perhaps and show all of the delivery information, maybe the tracking ID of jobs that were already sent to DHL or UPS or whatever you use for delivery. It could be something entirely different. The important thing is that Monday.com is very data agnostic, so you can use it for just about anything. And the apps we built here are equally data agnostic. The app doesn't care whether you are building a production workflow or dashboard, whether you are doing something about delivery, whether these are food orders, it doesn't matter. It just knows that there is information in the items that flow through the switch workflow, and that information has to be reflected in some way on Monday.com, and it lets you add that information to the board in Monday.com that you created. Okay, I think that is what it's exactly 5 o'clock. That is what I wanted to share. So we looked at 3 apps, one to create a very simple text file, one to create a text file still, but from a template, for which I've told you 6 times now to read the documentation, and then also the documentation online for the templating language, because it can do a lot. I know that. It's very flexible, and that means that you have to write the document, you have to read the documentation. And then the Monday.com app, which is a bundle app that consists out of 4 small little apps that can send information to Monday.com and update it afterwards. We've only used 3 here. What is number 4? Well, the get from Monday.com. Yeah. If I store information here, maybe at some point it would be a good idea to be able to read what the value of a particular column is. And you can do that as well. There is an app for that as well. So if there is anyone who has any questions, please unmute yourself and ask, or just write in the chat. And Jan, you had a comment. I completely agree, and it's exactly why I used this at some point as well. If you use mail send, the fact that you can create or prepare an HTML ahead of time using a templating engine is much easier than trying to just build it using switch variables. And what is certainly missing with switch variables is conditionals. You cannot easily do if then else things. AGS supports that. What is also missing is repeats. If you think that this is still pretty simple and limited. I can tell you that we, for a production workflow for a company close by here, I will not mention the name, but I think they agreed to do a Four Pees Café at some point. We still have to get that done. For a company close by here, we take information that comes in from Preflight, a web-to-print system, and we, on the fly, output a JDF file that goes to Prinect. And if you want to do that, then you need conditionals. You need to be able to do if then else in the template. You also need to be able to do repeats. If there are 5 jobs, you need to write 5 sections in the JDF, 1 for each job. That is something that you can easily, it is something that you can do in AGS. It requires a bit of JavaScript, but you can definitely do repeats as well. So if you have an array of information, then you can make sure that in the JDF you end up with multiple times the same item. Yeah? So we take information that comes in as XML from Preflight and we write out a JDF for Prinect, and that seems to work absolutely fine. Can the Monday.com app pull data from another data source to be displayed along with what comes from the switch flow? Well, the Monday.com app is always going to send data that lives in Switch or is available in Switch to Monday.com. But of course, nothing stops you from pulling information from the other data source first and then combining it with what you already have about the job. Very good example would be there is a job that comes in and the name of the job is a job ID. I could use the database connection or a script or the HTTP requests tool in Switch to pull the database, so get information from the database for that particular job with that particular ID. And that means at that point, I have the information in Switch, and then I can use these apps to update Monday.com with the information. So yes, you can do that, but you will need to construct a Switch workflow that gathers all the information that you need for a particular job and that then updates Monday.com with it. Again, the Monday.com apps are completely agnostic. They don't care where the information comes from or what it means. You just have to make sure it is available in the Switch workflow, and then they will push it to the board that you constructed in Monday.com. No other questions that I can see. Good. That was a small overview for all 3 of the apps. There is actually a documentation on the App Store that you can download. I think for at least one of them, there are also examples. I think for the text from templates, I believe there are also some examples on the App Store that you can download. If you have any questions beyond that, just send us an email. If you send mail to support@fourpees.com, then it will end up in the inbox of some of the lovely people joining this or also in this meeting, and then they will get you an answer on that. Of course, if you want something that is not possible using the app, or you think that something is missing, just send us an email as well, and we can talk about that. Thank you for joining this Four Pees Café. It was a pleasure to see so many of you this beautiful day, and I'm sure we will see many of you for the upcoming cafes, the next one of which is next week. Go to fourpees.com/events if I'm not completely mistaken. And there you will see a list of all the Four Pees cafes that are coming up, and you can subscribe for them. On the events page, you will, if I'm not very mistaken, also already find an item for the Calas PDF Toolbox 13 introduction thingies that come somewhere in November. You can already put that in your calendar as well, because that, of course, will also be interesting. If you would like to see a Four Pees Café about any type of topic that we haven't covered yet, then don't hesitate and again, send us an email. You can send me an email at david@fourpees.com. That should not be too difficult. We're always interested in hearing from you and getting more topics for upcoming cafes. If there is something that you missed, go to the YouTube page, to the playlist for the Four Pees Cafes, and you will find all of the recordings there as well. Thank you very much for joining, and see you next time.